Many people can go through their life without ever having to experience stereotypes. If you live in your own isolated community, not necessarily stereotypes put at you, but stereotypes directed unto others. When I said that you can go your whole life without living with stereotypes, the fact is you don't realize that they're stereotypes. If you don't ever have to interact with a group, you'll never realize that what you think of them as stereotypes. If someone told you what a stereotype was, you would know that that maybe you don't have any proof of it, but you can go generally, just thinking that anything you know about someone or think you know about them would be true. The fact is that discussion breaks down stereotypes. So for example, what are examples of indigenous stereotypes that are prevalent today? Well, a girl from the University of Toronto named Virginia McLaurin. She's an indigenous woman, and she decided to analyze 60 shows from 1990 to 2011 to see the stereotypes portrayed upon indigenous peoples. And she described it as there were two types of Indians, and I'm going to use the word Indians because that's what she used. She described them as a good Indian or a bad Indian, and the bad Indians the bad indigenous people portrayed on these shows and think this is as recent as 2011, that's 8 years ago, that the bad ones were out of touch with their culture, scheming, receiving benefits from the government, and manipulative, and they described good Indians as impoverished, living on reserves, completely culturally immersed, and the worst part that she thought was with that stereotype was that both of them couldn't be anything else except for what they were described as. If you were looking at one as strictly a bad Indian, it's not like, oh, he can have any other personality trait. No, he's just the thing that I've laid out for him in my mind. And they never strayed from those plot points, ever. They were side characters who filled out those check boxes, and that's what she described them all as in the 60 shows that she watched. And so, this shows current stereotypes of indigenous peoples. To first talk about it, we need to have a general idea of what we are dealing with, of this sort of idea of stereotypes in our heads, so that we can know what we're looking at. So, when you're talking about stereotypes, it's how I said that discussion breaks them down. Recently, we're in the era that Canada describes as the era of truth and reconciliation. And how does that relate to stereotypes? Well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission stated that their purpose is to establish and maintain a healthy relationship between those who are Indigenous and those who aren't. Now, it's plain and clear that a good relationship between two parties requires good communication. And when there's stereotypes, it's very hard to either have good communication or it's a symptom of bad communication. When you try and talk to someone that you have stereotypes in your head already about, it's very hard to have a conversation with them because you have gone into your head, you've gone into their ideas and said that this is all that they can think, and that they as well have done the same unto you. And so, how this relates back to truth and reconciliation, I would say, is that if you want to maintain a healthy connection with each other, you definitely don't want to go into there with stereotypes, because the whole truth and reconciliation of event in time right now is supposed to repair that bridge. And so, now that we know the stereotypes that they deal with, we need to talk about why we have already talked about why stereotypes form and how hatred and misunderstanding lead to stereotypes. Because people are not talking, if there's no communication, it's a bad relationship, and people become entrenched in stereotypes. They can't see anything other than what they've seen. And so, how do you get others to see what they need to see? How do you convince someone who has something in their head already about you that you aren't what they think you are? And so, how can we connect this into our lives? Well, for an example,
I'm going to, not specifically my life, but there's a show called Avatar: The Last Airbender, and it has a great example of how to break down stereotypes. But first, I want to talk about how putting people... First, I'm going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education, which was one of the first events in the Black Civil Rights Movement. And so, Brown versus Board of Education, what had happened was so it was 5 cases that were decided by the Supreme Court, and they were rulings to end segregation in schools. So, in 1954, the court case Brown versus Education happened. It was supposed to end segregation in the school systems so that blacks and whites could attend the same schools. And the really important thing that I want to stress is that the civil rights movement really kicked off when this happened. They in 1948, they let blacks and whites into the army, but that didn't mean that it was gonna start a civil rights movement, because that's just letting them participate with each other in something that they aren't being intellectual about. That's just them going and fighting. But when you go and fight in a war beside someone, you can't help but see the humanity in them, and that's a great neutralizer for any hatred that you can have for someone who saved your life. And so that led up to 1954's Brown versus Board of Education, where they wanted them in the same schools, and people challenged that idea. They didn't want them to be into the same schools because they had stereotypes. They had ideas of them, like the blacks had stereotypes about the whites, and the whites had stereotypes about the blacks, how they thought that they couldn't intermingle. In the Jim Crow era, the statement is separate but equal. If you're separate with someone, you can't have the same perspective as them. And that's why that statement is just false. So what had happened is, when you put 2 people in a room intellectually challenging each other, that means that you can't hide behind any stereotype, because a stereotype is something that you can tell someone if they're not in the room. But if you say it to their face, then they'll defend themselves, and they'll show you how they are not that stereotype. That's why I said, if you live in a community where you live with everyone who has the same ideas as you, you'll only have stereotypes for other people, but you won't have to disprove any of them, because there's no one there to challenge that. But that's why the whole civil rights movement started, because people were put into the same area as each other. And when you're in a school together, you're going to have discussions, and you're going to actually have to, because the only thing that matters in education is who's right and who's wrong. And so it doesn't matter what stereotypes you have of each other, because it can only be proven objectively. So that's how I'd say that you need to have someone you need to be in a room where 2 people have to be objective, so that you can fight stereotypes, or that you can have proper discussions. And so, back to the Avatar: The Last Airbender example. In the great episode The Great Divide, there's 2 feuding tribes. Their story is basically, their 2 heads of their families argued with each other. They got into a fight, and they separated from each other based on their argument was about different living standards. The Ganjin, which were a very clean and pampered tribe, thought that they should be separated from them because they didn't want them getting dirty, and the Zhangs thought that they were too clean and that they wouldn't let them live their lives properly. And so the Zhangs and Ganjins, they feuded with each other until one day their village was destroyed and they had to cross a great canyon. But in that great canyon, they got trapped with each other, and so they both had to live in the same area, presumably indefinitely. And instead of actually talking with each other, they split off from each other, and they started fighting. They started not fighting, but they started arguing. They started arguing with different people who are trapped in the canyon with them, trying to tell them their story. And basically, when they moved together, all the people who they told their stories to, when they were arguing with each other, they weren't as entrenched in their ideas. They didn't really have a stereotype, because they had been living outside of their isolated communities. And when they had to talk with them, they were the main point of mediation. And so basically, what I'm trying to get at here is the whole point of how the two tribes fixed each other's relations was that they had to talk to each other when they were trapped inside that canyon. But the important part was there was people to mediate there, because whenever Zhang would call Ganjin a slob, I mean a pampered, like way too uptight sort of person, they would say stop yelling at them, and then the Ganjins would call them Slavs, and they'd say, hey, stop, it's not gonna get us out of this canyon, it's not gonna solve this issue. But eventually they are both thrust into the same issue, and when they're both only focused on the issue, they aren't throwing stereotypes at each other. They're just trying to save each other's lives because they're getting attacked by a different group of people, and so it forces them to work together. When you're both targeting the same issue, when you're both trying to logically, coherently, objectively break down something that you know that you want to break down a problem, you have to think of it only in objective terms and without stereotypes. That's where knowledge comes in, rather than just what you think about a different person, because you're not focused on that different person. They can give a different perspective and you can give a different perspective, and all it's doing is solving a problem. And so I think that if you wanted to solve an issue where two people can't talk, you need to have them put into, first off, a room where they can't yell at each other, they can't give each other stereotypes, that they're forced to have discussion. And that's I'd say that's how I'd break down a stereotype if two people wouldn't talk to each other. And if you look back to the Ganjin versus the Zhangs, something that's really important is how they were stereotyped. When Europeans came over, they treated them terribly, and the Zhangs or the indigenous peoples in this sense, they were described as living in like savagery, like the Zhangs did. Obviously, so they separated from each other, and they didn't communicate with each other, and they didn't learn each other's way of life, because when the Zhangs and the Ganjins were fighting together, they had to realize that they weren't so different after all. And so how I would say that this applies to us is that if we wanted to have a proper discussion between the immigrants from Europe today and the indigenous peoples that were already here, we need to have, first off, a place where it's properly mediated, where we can't throw anything at each other, and as well where we're looking at objective problems. I would say that just having them included in discussions, firstly, would break down stereotypes, because when you're arguing for something to be logically coherent, you aren't arguing against a person, you're arguing against an idea. And I feel like what people have been trying to do in the Senate for far too long is trying to argue an identity and not an idea, things that can be objectively true and not just philosophically true. So what I would say how to solve this issue is to look at objective problems in the Senate without looking at identity, still including them, but helping us realize that we're not so different. And that's how I'd say that I would break down a stereotype in a community. And so how I would say that is you need to have it where there's two people on equal playing grounds. So the Chief of Indigenous Affairs, Perry Beauregard, he is the representation of basically what they've described as all indigenous people in our Senate. And so what I think is dangerous with that, what I think is good about that is because it's very hard for someone to just go against a complete government. And so I wouldn't say that that's really an equal playing field. And so if I had to give anyone a proper takeaway today, is that if you have a stereotype with someone, like how I've given examples, like how that relates back to indigenous peoples, and how basically if Beauregard wants to have a proper discussion, that it has to happen in a place where the Senate can look at them like they're on equal terms. like over 200, 300 senators or riding leaders going against one specific person, that's just an unfair discussion, or that's just an overwhelming discussion. And so what I would say is that communication needs to happen in a more equal standard place. So that's what I'd suggest. Okay, this has been my podcast. Thank you. I'm Jared Pileggi, and have a good day.